But it's a real privilege and an honor to be with you guys today here for the National Congress. I had an opportunity a few years ago when it was in Charleston to present then, and it's a wonderful organization. I've been a member of our commander there, and it's a great opportunity to get to come down and spend an afternoon with you guys today in Jacksonville. And it's also kind of a difficult spot to be in here late in the day on a Friday when I'm sort of one of the last things standing between you guys and the hospitality room. So we'll try to hustle this thing through. So I know how sailors are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Doolittle Raid, which I think is a story a lot of us know. But hopefully we can explore in a little bit more depth this afternoon. The Doolittle Raid was essentially America's answer to the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise raid on Tokyo that was executed just 4 months after the Japanese attacked Hawaii. It was a virtual suicide mission. 16 bombers crewed by 80 young airmen who flew a one-way mission to pummel Japan's factories, its shipyards, its munitions warehouses, and then escape to free China. But it was much more than just a bombing raid. The attack was a powerful tonic needed to rally a shell-shocked nation, to assure the U.S. public in its darkest hour that in the end, America would prevail. America would win. The effect the raid had on this country 7 decades ago was profound. Americans were so moved by the heroism of these 80 volunteer airmen that a war bond poster signed by Mission Commander Jimmy Doolittle fetched a staggering $4 million in 1942. That's the equivalent of almost $58 million today for a signed poster. A town in Missouri went so far as to change its name to Doolittle in his honor. And of course, the raid had even greater effects on the outcome of the war. The raid prompted the Japanese in the summer of 1942 to make an ill-fated grab for Midway, which ended in disaster, as they lost 4 aircraft carriers that day, and it shifted the balance of power in the Pacific back in favor of the United States. But it was the Chinese who paid the largest price. Outraged by the attack, Japan launched a retaliatory campaign against the Chinese that killed an estimated 250,000 men, women, and children and prompted comparisons to the rape of Nanking. All of these things happened because of one raid, because of 16 bombers crewed by 80 volunteer airmen. And that is what makes the Doolittle Raid one of the greatest stories of World War II. Now, the Doolittle Raid really began on the morning America entered World War II. In the pre-dawn hours of that Sunday, December 7th, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, at the time it was the largest carrier task force that had ever put to sea, cut through the dark swells roughly 230 miles north of Oahu. Throughout the aircraft carriers, Japanese airmen rose early, dressed in clean loincloths and pressed uniforms, and paused alongside Shinto shrines to pray for victory and sip sake before heading topside to their planes. The faint light of dawn punctured the morning clouds as the carriers increased speed and swung into the wind to prepare to launch. 183 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes roared off the carriers' decks in the first wave, followed by a second strike of 167 planes. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than just a raid, but the dramatic opening act of war against the United States. A surgical strike designed to mortally wound America's powerful Pacific fleet anchored in the cool Hawaiian waters. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, knew it was imperative for Japan to sideline the United States before the war even began. The fate of our empire, he warned in one of his final dispatches, depends upon this operation. In addition to targeting the Navy's warships, Japanese forces zeroed in on Hawaii's airfields, destroying about 200 planes that day. The attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed or damaged 18 ships, including 8 battleships. And pictured here is the capsized battleship Oklahoma. And of course, the human toll proved horrific. Casualties among soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines soared to more than 3,500, a figure that counted 2,403 who were killed that day. Now, President Roosevelt was in the White House finishing up his lunch when news of the attack reached Washington. And that afternoon, as damage reports continued to pour in, he wrote what was arguably his most famous speech, even though it totaled less than 500 words. His use of the word infamy, his son later noted, would forever describe what happened that day. The next day at 12:30 p.m., he delivered that speech before Congress, asking for a declaration of war. Now, personally, Roosevelt was sickened by the attack, and he knew that the immediate patriotism that flared up in the wake of Pearl Harbor would prove short-lived. But he also knew that America was in no position to go on the sustained offensive. It would take much of 1942, in fact, to enlist and train the troops, to build the battleships and the warships, the rifles and the bullets. Yet he knew that America's patience would not survive that long. So before rescuers could even pull all the dead from the oily waters of Hawaii, he summoned his senior military leaders and he demanded America find a way to strike back. Not an attack on some far-flung island in the Japanese Empire, but an attack directly on Tokyo. Of course, the challenge facing American war planners was just how to do it. America had no bases in the region from which to operate. In addition to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had seized Guam and Wake from the United States. The Philippines was under siege and would soon fall. The Japanese had likewise taken Hong Kong and Singapore from the British and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies from the Netherlands. In a few short months, Japan had established an empire that stretched across more than 20 million square miles in 7 time zones. Another way to look at that, literally 1/10 of the world was under the control of Japanese Emperor Hirohito. Not only did the United States not have any bases in the region from which to operate, but it was deemed too risky for us to send our handful of aircraft carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor all the way across the Pacific to the enemy's backyard. The short takeoff and recovery distances, short distances needed for takeoff and recovery of Navy planes made it so that these carriers would have to go too close into the enemy's waters, and simply was a risk that the United States could not afford to take. None of this, however, mattered to FDR, who in each of his meetings continued to press his senior leaders to find a way to strike back. And it was in January 1942, barely a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when one of Admiral King, who was CNO at the time, one of his senior officers, was down at Norfolk checking up on the aircraft carrier Hornet, which was being fitted out at that time. And he happened while he was down there to see Navy pilots practicing takeoffs on an airfield marked up to look like the flight deck of a carrier. And he had a thought. He just said, what if we swapped out shorter range Navy planes and replaced them with twin-engine Army bombers? And that idea, that sort of flash of an idea he had at that moment, would prove to be the genesis of what today we now know as the Doolittle Raid. Now, figuring out whether or not that idea would actually translate into an actual operation fell to 45-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, who was, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating characters of the 20th century. Jimmy Doolittle was born in California, but he grew up in Alaska, where his father was an unsuccessful gold prospector. Doolittle was small in stature. He stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall. Yet on all of his military records, he upped his height by 2 inches. And what he lacked in size, he made up for in spirit. And the Alaska of his youth was sort of a lot like the Wild West. I mean, it was a frontier town, Nome was. There were more saloons than there were grocery stores. He'd watched one of his best friends be chewed up by dogs. I mean, it was just a real rough and tumble kind of environment. And Doolittle realized that at 5 feet 4 inches tall, if he was going to survive, he'd have to learn how to fight. And he actually proved so good at it that he later became a professional boxer. Now, Jimmy Doolittle returned to California as a young man and enrolled in college. And he'd always harbored an interest in flying, and so when World War I began, he enlisted in the Army. And on his first flight, he fell in love with it. Doolittle proved so good at flying that rather than send him to Europe to fight, the Army decided to keep him home to train other pilots. Quote, "My students were going overseas and becoming heroes," he later lamented. "My job was to stay home and make more heroes." Now, when the war ended, Doolittle chose to remain in the service, recognizing that it was the one place where he could still fly every day and earn a steady paycheck. But this was the early era of aviation, and pilots were constantly testing themselves and their aircraft, sort of pushing the limits. There were speed competitions and endurance feats and things like that, and Doolittle, the boxer, decided he would jump right into that. He set a number of speed records. He's also the first pilot who ever flew cross-country in less than a day. It took him 22 hours to do that. And this, of course, was an era before GPS. So in order to navigate, he literally took Rand McNally road maps with him and literally looked down over the side in order to follow the road systems as he went west. Now, in addition to that, Doolittle was also brilliant. He earned his master's and his doctorate degrees from MIT. And he also recognized that one of the biggest challenges facing early aviation was the inability to fly if you couldn't see where you were going. So he helped develop the artificial horizon, which is standard on airplanes today. He's also the first pilot to ever take off, fly over a set course, and land again using only instrumentation. And he accomplished that while zipped inside a hooded cockpit. And so when they did the test, there was actually a pilot at a set of controls in front of him who had to fly with his hands above his head so that observers on the ground would see it was actually Jimmy Doolittle who was controlling the plane. The New York Times summed him up best in the 1920s when they said, quote, "Doolittle is as gifted with brains as he is with courage." Now, when World War II began, he was the staff troubleshooter for General Hap Arnold, who was the head of the Army Air Forces. And one of his first jobs was to figure out whether or not this operation to bomb Tokyo was feasible. Doolittle first looked at logistics. He had to determine which kind of plane might be able to do it. And he quickly decided that the B-25 was that plane. And the reason being was that the B-25 had about 7 feet of clearance from the wingtip to the superstructure of the carrier, the island. So the plane could just barely slide by and take off. But he also realized that it would make it impossible for the plane to ever land on deck again. So this was going to have to be a one-way mission. These pilots were going to have to take off, bomb their objective, and fly all the way to free China, to the areas that the Japanese didn't control, and escape that way. Now, as a result of that, he figured that they were going to have to fly about 2,400 miles. Now, the B-25 typically had a range of about 1,300 miles, so they're almost going to have to double the fuel capacity. So they came up with the idea of these 3 rubber bladders, if you will, that you could sort of shoehorn into empty compartments on the plane that you could fill up with fuel in order to increase your flying distance. Now, aviation fuel's heavy. A gallon of gas, aviation fuel, weighs about over 6 pounds. So if you're adding that much extra fuel, you have to strip out all that weight to compensate. So they took out things like the lower gun turret, the radio, you name it, they took it out. But they did develop a ruse. They took 2 black boards and stuck them out the tail. They literally look like broomsticks. And so they decided if you couldn't have a lower gun turret, you could at least have these boards that would look like you had a .50 caliber machine gun sticking out the back of the plane, even if it wouldn't actually work. Now, the next thing Doolittle had to do was pick his airmen. And the B-25 was a pretty new airplane in America's arsenal at that time. It would B-25s, we'd build about 10,000 of them over the course of the war, but at this time we only had a handful of squadrons that were flying them. Most of them in the Pacific Northwest, flying anti-submarine patrol. So Doolittle had those squadrons transferred to Columbia, South Carolina, not far from here. And from there, he ultimately picked what would be his 79 volunteer airmen. He then had those crews transferred to the Florida Panhandle, where they trained with a Navy pilot in the art of carrier takeoffs. Meanwhile, as Doolittle's doing all of this, the Navy is assembling its side of the operation, including putting together a task force of 16 warships under the command of colorful Admiral Bull Halsey. And the risks that the Navy was willing to take for this operation were extraordinary and can't be discounted. I know Jimmy Doolittle gets a lot of the credit and his airmen do, but really the risks that were born in this operation really fell on the shoulders of the United States Navy. And that's because these bombers, these B-25s, were too large to fit in an aircraft carrier's hangar elevator, which meant they'd all have to be tied down on deck. So if the Hornet got into trouble, there was no way to swap out the B-25s for fighters. So the United States would have to send a second aircraft carrier, the Enterprise, along for cover. So at that time, we only had 5 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet. Japan had 10. And here we were about to send 2 of those 5 carriers 5,200 miles across the Pacific and hope that nowhere along the way did they run into a stray merchant ship, submarine, patrol craft, anything like that that might endanger them. So the risks that the Navy was willing to take here were just extraordinary. April 2nd, 1942, just 16 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Hornet departed San Francisco bound for Tokyo. The carrier's only protection was this task force of warships, included 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers. Tied down on deck with wheels chalked were Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers. And here's a close-up shot of one of those bombers. The planes had so little room that the tail of the 16th bomber literally dangled over that carrier's fantail. and the task force steamed across the northern Pacific, taking a route that guaranteed cold, rough weather, but also decreased the likelihood that they would run into any other maritime traffic out there. But the weather was so rough that refueling the ships at sea, as you can see here, was pretty difficult, and a number of sailors actually were washed overboard and had to be recovered. As the task force neared Japan on April 17, 1942, Doolittle and his men held a brief ceremony on deck of the Hornet, in which they wired Japanese medals that had been given to American sailors during a 1908 visit to Yokohama to the bombs that would soon fall on Tokyo. And here's a close-up shot of one of those medals. Other sailors scrawled messages on the bombs, like the one penciled on the fin here that says, quote, "I don't want to set the world on fire, just Tokyo." Others read, "Bombs made in America, laid in Japan." A number of the sailors signed them, dedicating them to their parents and girlfriends as well. Then afterward, the airmen loaded their ammunition in preparation for the raid. Now, an important player in the Doolittle Raid is Admiral Yamamoto, who, as I noted earlier, is the Japanese architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Yamamoto is a lot like Doolittle in that he's one of the more interesting figures in the Japanese military at that time period. Yamamoto was a son of a samurai warrior, and yet he had actually attended Harvard and lived in the United States. And so he understood America's great national resolve. And so he was one of the few voices inside the Japanese military that said going to war with the United States is going to be a really bad idea. And at this time, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the fall of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Wake, and Guam, the Japanese public was really celebrating its nation's many successes. But this was a euphoria and a celebration that Yamamoto disdained, because he knew it was literally that only amount of time before America's aircraft carriers that were missing at Pearl Harbor were going to show up off the shores of Japan. And this fear of his really grew into an obsession, so much so that he demanded daily weather reports over Tokyo. And only on days when the weather was rainy or cloudy or whatnot would his staff say he appeared to be relieved. He went so far as to advise a geisha friend of his to move all of her property outside of the city. Yamamoto's fears ultimately led him to create a fleet of picket boats like the one you see here. The Japanese were not early adopters of radar like the United States, instead fell back on the strategy of sort of encircling the home islands with a bunch of small fishing boats and trawlers that would be anywhere from a few hundred miles to 1,000 miles offshore. The idea being that any inbound American task force would run into them and be able to radio ahead that the Americans were coming. But more than the picket boats, Yamamoto focused on America's aircraft carriers and how he could finish the job that his forces had failed to do at Pearl Harbor that day and destroy them. Because in the time between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Doolittle Raid, the United States aircraft carriers had executed a handful of raids in the far-flung Japanese islands, like places like New Guinea. The United States treated our carriers a lot like endangered species. We'd go in for a raid and then vanish before Japan had an opportunity to strike back. And Yamamoto looked at it like a game of Russian roulette. It was literally a matter of time before those carriers weren't off of Marcus Island, but were off of Tokyo. And so he had to find a way to lure American carriers into a direct battle so that he could finish the job his forces had failed to do at Pearl Harbor. Now, he wanted to go back and attack Hawaii again, but the Army would never allow it. So he set his sights instead on Midway, which was the perfect piece of Pacific real estate in the eyes of the United States. Small coral atoll about 1,200 miles from Oahu was home at the time of an air base and also a submarine base. And Yamamoto knew that the United States would never let it fall without a fight. And so he began to advocate that Japan take Midway. And to his surprise, he encountered pushback, not just from the Army, which he expected, but from others during the Navy. Now, at this time that he's having this argument with others in Japan, literally Doolittle is coming across the Pacific. And little does Admiral Yamamoto know, but Jimmy Doolittle is about to help him make his final sales pitch. Each hour, each mile, the American warships now are closing in on the enemy's backyard. And throughout the task force, the earlier excitement over the mission is now replaced by soaring tensions, as radio men literally are hunkered over their receivers 24 hours a day, monitoring Japanese communications for any signs that they've been detected. No one stewed more than Jimmy Doolittle. The Hornet's chaplain saw him one night literally pacing from rail to rail, the weight of this entire mission on this one man's shoulders. Now, early on the morning of the 18th, the task force radars began to light up with blips indicating these fishing boats, these trawlers that Yamamoto had placed out there. And at this time, the task force is still about 1,000 miles away from Japan. And so rather than engage, Halsey makes the decision that they're going to sort of thread their way through them as best they can. Literally at this time, each hour, each mile really mattered. Finally, at daybreak on April 18th, 1942, the task force was spotted. They could run no longer. American pilots and gunners sprang into action, ultimately destroying several of these picket boats and capturing several Japanese POWs. But not before those picket boats were able to radio ahead that 3, not 2, they radioed 3 American carriers were inbound toward Tokyo. So at this point, all secrecy is now lost. Not only has the cat out of the bag, if you will, but at this point, they're more than 800 miles from Tokyo. And when Doolittle had began to plan this operation, he'd set 400 miles as the optimal takeoff distance. From 400 miles, he could take off, bomb their objectives, and still have enough fuel to make it to free China. He'd set 650 miles as the maximum from which they could accomplish all of that. They're more than 800 miles at the time that they've been discovered. So not only have they've been discovered, the cat's out of the bag, and they're too far out at sea. All of these things are sort of weighing on Jimmy Doolittle at this moment. Taking off now is essentially a suicide mission. So what does Jimmy Doolittle do? Well, the weather that morning is atrocious. Heavy seas are crashing against the bow of the Hornet, sending sea spray over the deck. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the first bomber. Just 467 feet separated him from the cold Pacific waters. He flashed the thumbs up sign to the signal officer who clutched a checkered flag. Sailors pulled the wheel chocks out as an officer waved his flags in circle, signaling Doolittle to push the throttles all the way forward. "Everything ready?" he asked his crew chief. "Everything's okay, Colonel," came the response. The signal officer dropped the flag and Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber roared down the flight deck at 8:20 a.m. Doolittle passed 50 feet, then 100, then 200. "He's never going to make it," someone on deck shouted. The bomber charged toward the end of the flight deck and appeared to vanish. "Doolittle's gone," one of the Army navigators thought to himself. "We'll have to make it without him." But then the bomber roared up into the gray skies over the carrier's bow. Sailors crowded along the flight deck, and the carrier's island erupted in cheers. Quote, "The shout that went up should have been heard in Tokyo," the mission's doctor later remembered. The other 15 bombers followed Doolittle, one right after the other, flying just above the wave tops, inbound toward Japan. The 16 bombers came in, they crossed over the Japanese landscape, headed toward Tokyo and other key industrial cities like Osaka, Kobe. Each plane carried just 4 bombs. Crews flew over baseball games and schools. Children waved. A few even threw rocks at one of the bombers as it came in over one of the beaches. As air crews came in toward Tokyo, they could see the muddy moat that encircled Emperor Hirohito's palace. This is one of only 2 photographs shot from the cockpits of the bombers that survived the attack on Tokyo. This is actually shot from the 13th bomber, and it's a view of the Yokosuka Naval Station. And here is the other shot that survived the mission. Now, there have been several books done on the Doolittle Raid in the past, but until now, no one has ever gone into Japan's archives to see what kind of documentation on the raid exists from their perspective. And what's amazing is that some of the records actually still do exist. And it's amazing for a couple of reasons. One, as the war was winding down and the Japanese began to destroy much of their documentations, that wouldn't fall into our hands. And number 2, we firebombed Tokyo pretty extensively and destroyed a lot of the city in 1945. But miraculously, the after-action report of the Doolittle Raid still survived. And on that report, we're about onto that report. Now, we don't know what happened to the negatives, but those photos we were able to scan in order to be able to reproduce. And some of those are what you see here on the screen overhead. The photo you're looking at here actually gives you a sense that it's actually some some homes in Tokyo that were hit, and you get a sense of the architecture in Tokyo at that time, which was 98% wood and paper. So, I mean, it really showed that the Japanese cities were perfect for incendiary type strikes. Here's another photograph of a wooden factory building that was destroyed by pilot Harold Watson's plane. And here is a crater left by one of the 500-pound demolition bombs. All told, the raid killed 87 people and injured about 500. The raiders obliterated 112 buildings and damaged another 53, which is pretty amazing considering there were just 16 bombers involved. This is the bomb crater near the Asahi Electrical Manufacturing Corporation, which measured more than 15 feet wide and 10 feet deep. And here, a couple of Japanese officials look on a bomb crater, and it gives you sort of a sense of perspective on how large it is. The same is true for this one. This individual, this Japanese officer, he's actually standing in the middle of a crater that's about 6 feet deep and almost 43 feet wide. And it's surrounding him is the debris from the factory building that had been there. And you can see that the force of the explosion blew out a lot of the panels and windows of the adjacent factory as well. This is a Tokyo area home that was destroyed. And here's another picture of that same residence as people are beginning to sort of salvage around it. Now the Japanese were really insistent on trying to figure out what kind of ordnance we'd use, and so we had a few duds, particularly with our incendiaries, and so they, whenever possible, they literally dug them up in order to examine them. And so what you're looking at here actually is sort of inside of a building looking out, and you can see a big hole where an excavation is going on. Sort of the bombs went right down the side. And here are the Japanese workers literally digging down into the pluff mud in order to find it. And then, boom, about 15 feet down, they finally recovered it. So, this is a photograph from the Yomiuri newspaper soon after the raid. And you can see one of the bombers flying, literally just barely above rooftop level through the skies, and the black clouds of anti-aircraft fire around it. And of course, the Japanese media at that time was controlled by the government and the military, and so all the headlines were filled with propaganda. And one of the headlines here reads, quote, "As pledged, a glorious defense of the homeland," which is a humorous considering all the bombers made it in and out of Japan without any problems. Only 2 of them actually got any anti-aircraft fire, any shrapnel from anti-aircraft fire. It was all very minor. All the planes made it out of Japan. Low on fuel, 1 pilot diverted to Russia, where authorities interned him and his crew for 13 months. The rest then flew on toward mainland China. And since they'd taken off so early, the fuel lights came on. Crews were all preparing that they were going to have to bail out here over the East China Sea. Waters filled with sharks. And then suddenly, as they're preparing for this, a big tailwind comes out and just blows them the rest of the way across. And the raiders dubbed that the hand of heaven that pushed them there. But even with that hand of heaven, their luck soon ran out as they closed in on the Chinese coastline. And the blue water began to turn brown from the mud and the sediment. The weather then deteriorated. Heavy rains and whatnot began to beat against the cockpit windshields. And here they were aiming for runways tucked between mountains, and mountains that were as high as 10,000 feet. And it was impossible for the raiders in this kind of nightfall and bad weather to try to find that. So the majority of them either bailed out or crash landed at this point along the Chinese coast. 3 of the raiders were killed during this time. 8 were captured by the Japanese, and the rest received help from locals and missionaries. Here's a picture of Jimmy Doolittle the day after the raid, sitting alongside the wing of his bomber. And Doolittle at this point was just super distressed. He didn't know what had happened to the majority, even of his own crew, much less the rest of the folks on the mission. And so he was really dejected sitting here. And so his crew chief, Paul Leonard, came up to him and said, "It's not as bad as you think." And Doolittle says, no, it pretty much is. And Leonard says, no, in fact, this was a big success, and I predict that they are going to give you the Medal of Honor for this. And Doolittle said, no, look, Paul, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but really, they're going to court-martial me is what they're going to do. So Leonard realized he has to up his game, so he comes back and says, not only are they going to give you the Medal of Honor, but I predict they're going to make you a general. You got to remember he's a lieutenant colonel at this point, so you have to skip being a full colonel in order to do that. Now, we're going to come back to that story in a few minutes, so hold on to that thought. One thing I will add, too, is Doolittle's bomber. There's a Chinese historian who has been going around with a handheld GPS, who's been excavating and sort of pinpointing all the crash sites of the Doolittle bombers. And I meant to bring it with me today, but I have a small fragment of Doolittle's bomber that he gave me in April at the Raider reunion up at the Air Force Museum. And so 8 of those bombers have actually now been found. They've all been stripped of anything long ago that was remotely valuable. And one of the Raiders actually went back over there. One of the Raiders' sons went back over there this past year to China, and he was on Ted Lawson's crew, the one that 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And he came back with all sorts of parts of his dad's plane. All the villagers literally offered him up hydraulic lines. I mean, everything. I'm sure TSA loved it when he was coming back in, but it's a pretty amazing collection. So here's another photograph of Doolittle's wrecked B-25. And the air crews were literally scattered across about a 400 square mile area, and they had to find their way overland. And here's a photograph of Doolittle after he finally reunites about 24 hours later with the rest of his crew. And if you look to the right of Doolittle, to the left of Doolittle here, Doolittle's right, our left, you'll see Dick Cole. And Dick Cole was Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot, and he's the last surviving Doolittle Raider. Dick is 101, well 102 I think now, and he just celebrated his birthday in September, and he's still really active. I've seen Dick. I've done 3 different events with him this year, and he still goes to air shows, rotaries, high schools, and does all that, and continues to give back long after he has had the opportunity to retire from public service. So. Now, a few of the Raiders were injured, none worse than Ted Lawson. If you saw 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, that's Ted Lawson's plane. He ultimately had to have his left leg amputated in a primitive Chinese field hospital by the mission's doctor. That hospital's still there in China today. The operating room where they did that surgery has been preserved, and it looks almost just like it did when he was there. The other Raiders had to make their way overland across rural China using any form of transportation available, including sedan chairs and rickshaws. One crew even rode miniature ponies. And everywhere the Raiders went, they were celebrated as heroes. And that hero status was made official when the Raiders reached Chiang, which was China's wartime capital. And there, Madam Chiang Kai-Shek awarded them Chinese commendation medals. Here's a photograph of Doolittle with Madam Chiang Kai-Shek, and there's Dick Cole on the end there. Now, all the Raiders loved Madam Chiang Kai-Shek. I mean, she was, and a lot of folks don't know this, she was beautiful, and she wore these elegant dresses and all. And she'd studied in the United States. She'd actually gone to school in Georgia. And so she spoke fluent English, and she spoke it with a Southern accent. And so the Raiders called it her Scarlett O'Hara accent. And so they were all, they were falling over each other. She was like, I want to have, one of your caps. And so they were all falling over themselves to give them to her and whatnot. So they all wanted to get their picture taken with her too. And so several of the Raiders were lined up, and she was standing in front of them, a lot like you see here. One of the Raiders looks at his buddy and says, "Man, I can never show my girlfriend this." Madam Chiang overheard that, and she turns around and she looks at him and she goes, "Is she a blonde or is she a brunette?" So now, Doolittle's biggest honor, however, awaited him when he got back to Washington. And that's where President Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor, nation's highest award for heroism, and he also learned that he'd been promoted to Brigadier General. And so it just goes to show you always got to listen to what your crew chief says. They know best. So for 8 of the captured Raiders, however, the story was far from over. The Raiders went on to suffer horrific beatings, torture, waterboarding at the hands of the Japanese. The Raiders were eventually put on trial and convicted in a sham proceeding that lasted less than 30 minutes. The Japanese sentenced all 8 of them to life in prison, but ultimately commuted the sentences of 5 of them. Sentenced 8 of them to death, but ultimately commuted the sentences of 5 of them to life in prison. 3 of those Raiders, however, would face the firing squad, including Billy Farrow, who's a native of Darlington, South Carolina, just right up the road from here. Now, the Japanese, on the eve of the Raiders' executions, allowed them all to write final letters home to their families. The Japanese never mailed those letters, however, but miraculously they were found after the war in a Shanghai funeral home. So eventually they were given to the families, just not until after the war. And it's pretty amazing that they survived too. But those letters are a powerful window into these final moments in the mindset of these captured American airmen. And on the eve of his execution, Billy Farrow wrote 4 letters. He wrote one to his mother, his aunt, his best friend, and his girlfriend, whom he'd met as a student at the University of South Carolina. And he showed an incredible sense of maturity for a 24-year-old on the eve of his execution. He wrote to her, quote, "You are to me the only girl that would have meant the condition of my life. I have realized the kind of life being married to you would have meant to me and to both of us, and I know we would have found complete happiness. It is a pity we were born in this day and age. At least we had part of that happiness. Find yourself the good man you deserve, because you have so much to give the right one." Now, the Japanese came for Billy Farrow, Dean Hallmark, and Harold Spatz on the afternoon of October 15th, 1942, taking them out to Public Cemetery No. 1 on the outskirts of Shanghai. There, the raiders were made to kneel and were bound to 3 white crosses like the ones you see here. The Japanese then placed a white cloth around each airman's head with a black dot drawn to mark the center of the forehead. A single shot killed each of those 3 raiders. Now, the other raiders would go on to spend 40 months in Japan's notorious prisoner of war camps, where Raider Bob Meter starved to death. This is actually a message that the raiders carved into the floorboards of one of their cells. And at the war's end, this floorboard was cut out and was used as an exhibit in the war crimes trial. And if you're ever up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and you go to the National Air Force Museum there, this floorboard is on display there. It's a really powerful and haunting relic to see. Now, the Doolittle Raid eradicated the opposition to Yamamoto's plan to take Midway. If American carriers could strike Tokyo, then the flat tops were still a threat and needed to be destroyed. However, the June 1942 battle ended in total disaster for the Japanese, costing them 4 aircraft carriers and shifting the balance of power in the Pacific in favor of the United States. But it was the Chinese, however, who paid one of the largest prices. In an effort to prevent America from ever using those coastal airfields again, as well as to punish the locals who had helped Doolittle and his men, the Japanese launched a 3-month campaign that led to an estimated 250,000 deaths. Troops cut the ears and noses off of villagers, set others on fire, and drowned entire families in wells. The Japanese not only used incendiary squads to systematically torch more than 24 cities, towns, and villages, but also unleashed bacteriological warfare in the form of anthrax, plague, cholera, and typhoid. And this is a part of the story that we haven't known much about until more recently, in part because the United States didn't have any boots on the ground at that point. In fact, it'd be October of 1942 before the first American intelligence officer went into this area. But there were a lot of American missionaries there. And during my research, I uncovered their files at DePaul University up in Chicago. And their records, which include everything from diaries and letters to the property claims that they filed with their damage claims that they filed with their insurers over the destruction of their parishes, provided an incredibly powerful window into this horrific violence. What you're looking at here actually are some of the photographs. As the Japanese, it was a lot like Sherman's march through the South. They would come into an area, destroy everything, and then march on down to the next village. And so the missionaries would flee out into the woods, like you can see here. They would build sort of lean-tos and whatnot and wait them out. And then as soon as the Japanese left, they would go back down, survey the damage, send letters to the next village down or next couple of villages down by messenger, warning people to get out. And so those letters provide an incredible window here. In fact, Father Wendelin Dunker wrote to his bishop after he got back to his town of Yingtang, quote, "They killed anybody and everybody for no reason at all. Every town they enter is another Nanking on a smaller scale." Father Vincent Smith echoed him in his own letter when he said, "I cannot tell you the full story of the brutalities inflicted on these helpless people, on men, women, and children, even upon babies. No civilized mind can conceive the tortures which were inflicted on all." Now, at the war's end, the 4 surviving Doolittle Raiders were released from prison, all weighing less than 100 pounds. Chase Nielsen would later return to China as the star witness in the war crimes trial against Japan. And here, the executioner of the other 3 raiders, Sotojiro Tatsuda, bows to Nielsen during those proceedings. Now, 4 of the men who played a role in the imprisonment and execution of Doolittle's Raiders were sentenced between 5 and 9 years in prison. However, the Japanese general who signed the actual death order for them, by the time the war ended, had become too valuable of a post-war intelligence asset. And so MacArthur, MacArthur's chief of intelligence, stonewalled the war crimes prosecutors and essentially ran out the clock, preventing him from ever being prosecuted. He was then secretly released from Sugamo prison and later went on to serve in Japan's parliament before he was killed in a car wreck in the 1960s. Now, Doolittle had promised his men on board the Hornet that after the mission he'd throw them all a party at his expense. And with the war finally over and the last of his raiders home from prison, Jimmy Doolittle prepared to deliver. And he threw a party in Miami in December 1945 that started a tradition that carried on all the way up until this year, in which the raiders would literally get together every year and sort of celebrate this mission and celebrate their fraternity. They did that every year except for 2, once during Korea and once during Vietnam. Now, in 1959, the city of Tucson presented them with 80 silver goblets. And these goblets were inscribed with each raider's name, right side up and upside down. The idea being that when a raider passed away, that goblet could be flipped upside down, you could still read it, but it symbolized his passing. So raiders have done this year after year after year, even as their numbers have dwindled. Doolittle eventually gave them a bottle of cognac from 1896, which was the year Jimmy Doolittle was born. And the idea being that the last 2 surviving raiders would get together and they would open that bottle of cognac and they would toast the other 78. Now, those raiders, finally, about 4 years ago, there were only 4 of the raiders left, and one of them was incapacitated and couldn't travel. And the other 3 were scattered all over the country, Texas to Montana. And so they decided they might as well go ahead and, in case something happened, they're all in their 90s, in case something happened, they wanted to make sure that they could still get together. So they went ahead, those 3, and had that final ceremony. And they got together up in at the Air Force Museum there and opened up that bottle of cognac and toasted all the other raiders. Now, I had asked Dick Cole afterwards. I said, Dick, so I'm dying to know, I think a lot of people probably are. I mean, this is a bottle of cognac from 1896. This is 16 years before the Titanic sank. What did it taste like? And he said, it was really smooth, actually. And he said, the biggest problem? I said, yes. And he goes, they were chintzy with how much they gave me. Now, we thought that was going to be the end of the Raider experience there, but the Raiders, even after that final toast, continued to get together. Those last 3, all the way up until this year. The second to last Raider, Dave Thatcher, passed away last summer, 2016. And so this year, with Dick Cole's the last Raider, Dick returned to the Air Force Museum and then to turn over Dave's goblet. And Dave Thatcher's son, Jeff, is a really good friend of mine, and so Jeff invited me to attend the ceremony, and it was in a conference room there. It was just family and friends. And it was an incredibly powerful experience to witness this fraternity, this bond over all these more than 7 decades. Because when they did it, Dick stood there, and they again brought that bottle of cognac back out, which had a few hits on it in the previous years, and poured him a glass. And then they did a roll call, and they read every single Raider's name. And as Dick stood there, he said, "Here, here, here." And then at the end, he toasted them, and they turned over Dave Thatcher's goblet. And so it's really that story of the Doolittle Raiders. Really, it sort of comes full circle all the way back to this year and that final goblet. So that concludes my formal presentation. If we've got time, I'm happy to answer any questions. If not, you can catch up with me afterwards. So.